All right, I think we're ready to get started. Can you see my screen? Give me the thumbs up. Awesome. All right, so real quick announcement. Evan Reich is on, and he's going to be monitoring the chat. So if you have any questions, feel free to send him a question in the chat. You can either do a direct message or you could send it to the whole group. Feel free to send that in though, and we will get started. Okay, we'll get started and it's not working. There we go. All right, so good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Cranford, and I am the University Registrar at Anderson University in South Carolina. I make that distinction because there are two of us. There is an Anderson University in Indiana, and we share names. I have been at Anderson University for a little over a year. Before that, I was at public and private four-year institutions in North Carolina, Kentucky, and South Carolina. As we jump into reviewing business processes for continuous process improvement, I wanted to ask a couple of questions. And to get us started, the very first questions I wanted to ask to get our minds thinking about this topic is, who are we and what do we do? So we are all in higher education. I would imagine a lot of us are in registrar's offices, admission offices, and there are other enrollment management offices, I'm sure, represented. So as higher education professionals, we work with students, and we expect those students to grow and learn during their time with us, right? And that is the goal of education. That's what we want. So my question or my challenge, and this is even a challenge for myself, should we not be growing and learning ourselves and setting a good example for our students while they are with us? And technology is ever changing, so we have a built-in opportunity to grow and to change. And one example of growth and change is continuous process improvement. So that's why we are here. None of us are perfect, and all of our processes we could always find a way to improve them. But the challenge is, number one, I'm sure, especially with the year we've all experienced, finding the time to do that, and then two, finding the motivation and the tools to help us make that easier. My second question is, how many people have heard one of these three statements? We don't really have good documentation. Any hands raised on that one? Or we don't have any documentation. My personal favorite, we don't really need documentation. We've got lots of really good people with lots of knowledge. I think I've heard that one the most. So my question to that very last one is, what happens when those really good people retire or they win the lottery? Notice I didn't say get hit by a bus. I don't like that phrase. They won the lottery, they're no longer with us, and we need to figure out how they were doing what they were doing. And when they walked out the door, their knowledge went with them. So my last question, and I worked with someone that this was his pet peeve. So how many of you have heard or experienced this conversation? So why do you do it that way? And here's the answer. Ready? Because we've always done it this way. I can see some nodded heads. I can see somebody speaking along with me. So I did work with a technical director who absolutely detested that phrase. So I will tell a little bit of a personal story with documentation. And I know at least one person in this session endured this season of life with me. We had, a few years ago, a huge effort to document all of the processes in the registrar's office that I worked at the time. And we had made lots of progress. And it got down to the very last thing that needed to be documented. And it was a huge process that was run through the system office, and we needed to document our office's pieces of this huge process. And it was daunting. I couldn't wrap my head around how to actually document that process so that people who needed to follow me and then I needed to train could actually work the process. It was so large. And as I think back on that task, I thought about business process mapping and how it would have been so helpful had I known how to do it then. My last question as a point of introduction to this topic is, how many of you see documentation as daunting, and how many see change as daunting, or you know people who do see change as daunting? Is that something you've experienced? And so the encouragement that I have to offer there is neither one has to be daunting. In reviewing business processes, mapping and analysis provide tools that can equip us to visualize the process and then complete the necessary documentation while providing the outline and demonstrating need for good change. And when I say demonstrating the need for good change, I emphasize the word good, and I use the word demonstrating intentionally, because if we do the business process analysis and mapping well, we have the data that we need to take to our leadership to propose those changes, the thorough documentation that they would be wanting from us. So in this session, we're going to be looking to cover the definition of business process and business process analysis, the benefits of a business process analysis, which I will refer to as a BPA from this point forward, elements of a BPA, basic how-to, and then prioritizing those BPAs for your office or your area. I realize some of us may have areas within an office that we are managing, so we can do that within the office or the office as a whole. So first up, the definition. A longer definition, I've got an excerpt on the screen. A business process is a collection of linked tasks which find their end in the delivery of a service or a product to a client. I'm going to insert the word here, student. We serve students. They are our clients. A business process has also been defined as a set of activities and tasks that, once completed, will accomplish an organizational goal. The process must involve clearly defined inputs and a single output. These inputs are made up of all the factors which contribute either directly or indirectly to the added value of a service or product. These factors can be categorized into management processes, operational processes, and supporting business processes. And I've got the source there on the screen with a link. I refer to these as BPAs, so the business process analysis, or sometimes you'll hear BPM, business process map or mapping. Sometimes people use the word model there. This definition that I provided is a very business-like definition, and when I say business, I mean the business world or the IT world. And we may be tempted to think that it doesn't apply to us as higher education professionals. However, principles from information technology and business can greatly help us support our students, faculty, and staff. They're extremely helpful when we start looking at the business process, the swim lanes, where students come in, where faculty come in. Those things are extremely helpful. All right, so what are the benefits of a BPA? The very first thing at the top of the list, it creates cross-functional collaboration. So I've worked in large registrar's offices, small registrar's offices. I've also been a part of an implementation team that pulled together 16 to 30 members of the campus to focus on implementing the student information system, a data conversion. That was a very large process, and part of the process was to eliminate customization. When eliminating customizations to a student information system, it required business process change. And that is where I first learned about mapping business processes. And it was extremely helpful to have those discovery sessions with people in the registrar's offices from different areas. So if you're in a large registrar's office, sometimes you can have a whole team serving graduation audits, a whole team serving registration and records. You can also have, a separate team doing your degree requirements. Getting all those people together in a collaborative effort to map our processes is very helpful. Likewise, you can have discussions about student billing that have effects on registration and financial aid, and it's helpful to have the registrar's office, the business office, and your financial aid team all together having a collaborative conversation. And then we'll move on to the other benefits. It identifies owners and decision makers. I believe that one is self-explanatory, but finding the decision maker is vital to understanding the benefits of a BPA. The identification of the decision maker will provide direction for change when it is necessary. So that is why that one's listed as second. I'm sorry, yes, second. Identifies and differentiates between actors and stakeholders. Sometimes this is difficult for us to understand, but as we go through a business process analysis and a mapping, we will figure out who actually is an actor and then who cares about the process but doesn't necessarily have to be involved in the day-to-day of the process. It does help pull that to the surface for us. It identifies the progress and the successes and our pain points. Pain points are something that people on our front lines, the people who work for us, the people who serve with us, they can identify pain points very easily, but it's extremely important for us to be able to identify those as we're mapping a process so that we can address them if at all possible. And that's, one of the catalysts for change. And one of the ways to do that is to ask two questions: what's going well and what could be improved? So I have an example here, and maybe this will ring true, or maybe it's just me. Process changes of major. How many times do our students like to change their major? I know of one student who in one semester changed her major 12 times. I also know of a student who tried to change her major, I want to say between 20 and 30 times before the major change processor said to the student, "I will not process another change until you go and speak with an exploratory advisor." This is for your good. All right, and then the BPA can also identify opportunities and challenges. So seeking to remain positive, all challenges are simply opportunities for process improvement. And this is where that challenge from the introduction comes in. We are in institutions of higher education. We should be willing and capable of learning, growing, and improving, just like we expect from our students. And then finally, we have the last benefit noted here is the BPA provides documentation for change proposals. The most recent one to my mind is the graduation application timeline for my current institution. When I came into this role, one of the things that the VP that I worked for mentioned to me is that the timeline for the graduation application seemed extremely long. A student would apply for graduation in September before graduation in May. And so there was a desire to help the students and shorten that timeline. And so that business process was one of the first ones that we conducted in the registrar's office here at Anderson. And the documentation that came out of that BPA was extremely helpful to both my leadership and to our provost in order to help us find a better timeline that works for our students and our institution. So next up, what are the elements of a BPA? So the very first thing is a discovery session. So the discovery session is where you'll have the people gather, we'll have a conversation, talk through all of the pieces of the business process. And then the output of that meeting is going to be a business process map and potentially a narrative. The narrative looks very much like documentation for your process. I've listed here that it is optional, but the narrative can be extremely helpful. And I do, once we get to that part of the presentation, I do have an example to scroll through and show you. So here we go. Here's a basic how-to. So the very first thing is to gather the people. Don't be afraid to invite people who may be interested in the process. You may think, oh, they don't really participate. We don't need to bother them. Invite them. They can turn it down if they don't have time or they don't think it applies. But this is where that cross-functional collaboration is going to come from, is inviting people to the conversation. But definitely invite the key people involved. So if they work in and with the business process, if it touches something that they do, invite them to the discussion. And then something that our COVID world has taught us is that a discovery session can be conducted over Zoom. This is something that we had to learn how to do remotely last spring, but it can be done. Zoom and other tools have whiteboard functionality. We have sticky notes, quote unquote. I love sticky notes. I love a good Sharpie and a sticky note and a whiteboard, and I love to be able to map this out on a whiteboard in a room with people, but it can be done remotely. There are tools such as Lucidchart and Visio that will help you visualize these business process maps. So the next step is to name the process, and this may seem trivial, but it's very helpful to come up with a standard naming convention for your BPAs. Some decide to use an acting verb to begin each title, and those are the examples I will provide. I've got 3 examples. Processing university withdrawals, evaluating graduation applications, setting up registration controls. Now raise hands, anybody understand all of these titles? Lots of shaking heads. All right, the next is to brainstorm the owners or the owner, actors, and the stakeholders. And at first, especially if this is the first BPA that you're conducting, that's going to be something that's confusing to people. So just tell them, anybody you think may be involved at all, shout it out, we'll put it on the board, and then we'll figure out where they go. If they're an owner, if they're an actor, or a stakeholder. Usually it's easier to figure out who the owner is, and I'll go back to our evaluating graduation applications example. That owner is the university registrar. So you can visualize a whiteboard. We've got a big circle in the middle, and you would put university registrar in the middle of that circle, and then you would begin to put on the outside of the circle anybody who would be involved or related to the process. Those are going to be your actors and your stakeholders. And then identify the inputs and the outputs. So what information is needed to begin this process? So that's going to be your inputs. And then what deliverable does this process produce? That is going to be your output. So the inputs for evaluating graduation applications includes a graduation application. A student has to submit the application in order for us to evaluate it. The output would be a list of all graduates with their statuses: cleared, meeting requirements, not meeting requirements, or must reapply. Just a quick example there, but that is one example of an output. Then the next part would be to map the steps. And again, I mentioned one of the ways to do this, if you're able to meet in person, would be Sharpies with sticky notes, putting them on the board. And the reason the sticky notes are beneficial is because they can move around. But in our Zoom world, we can use tools like Lucidchart or Visio, and those boxes can be, we can click and drag them around as well. So we can do it just as well remotely. And then finally, identify the pain points, challenges, and opportunities. Again, ask the question, And people who are involved in this process, they're not going to be too shy with the pain points at the end of the process. And I've noted a tip here. Have an informed scribe for this session, so someone that's not necessarily involved in your discovery session or in this business process, but is a good note taker and a very good listener, because if they're actively listening to the conversation, they're going to pick up on the pain points that maybe even won't be brought out. So that's something just to throw out there. They'll be able to find those pain points and challenges. But another way to get that conversation going about pain points, challenges, and opportunities, again, is the questions, what's going well and what could be improved? All right, here, next up, I've got a couple of pictures from some business process mapping. This would be a whiteboard, very much not stickies, but still a whiteboard. This is from a graduation, or not graduation, but a graduate school application. Here's another example, and this is the one I am using most in my discussions or in my examples. This would be the sticky note version, where you've got the circle on the board, which I mentioned, and inside the circle is the owner, and around the outside are the actors and the stakeholders. And one way to figure out the difference between an actor and a stakeholder, so you can see the bottom half of the board where the stickies are. Each color signifies a different actor. So we've got student, advisor, and then registrar's office staff. So really there are 3 actors. So if we were to draw a box around student, advisor, and registrar staff on the top half of the board, the people who would not be in boxes, those are your stakeholders. So that's, when I say it's very easy to identify, that's what I mean. Once you get done with the mapping of the steps, go back to your actors, stakeholders, figure out who's actually acting and who's not, they're your stakeholders. Any questions about that before I move on? All right, next up, a couple of electronic versions of maps. This one's complex. Again, this is the graduation application map. So we mapped out 2 versions, the old version and the new version. The old version had where the office was manually auditing 3 times for every graduation, and we dropped it down to 2 audits. There's 1 audit for students if they are meeting requirements. They go one direction. If they're not meeting, then they'll have a second audit. And then everyone is viewed before actually awarding degrees. Here's another example. This is processing university withdrawals for our institution. We have a very specific student information system that is not all that popular, I don't believe. And so this is very much specific to our SIS. All right, next up, the elements of a narrative. And I mentioned at the beginning that this would be optional, however, very beneficial. And I'm more than happy to share a template. So if anyone would like a template, I will put my email address in the chat, and I will be happy, more than happy to send over the template for this narrative. So in the document, it would have, someone picked up on our SIS in the chat. Yes, you know it well. So in the narrative, we would include the business process title, the process owner, actors, stakeholders, the current process. You can stop here unless you have the desire to have a change. And so this is where the narrative will help you identify where those changes can be. And so beyond that is the proposed new process, rationale and implications of that change, the requirements, and the timeline. So let's look real quick at the example narrative. You will not be able to read it. It's a video. I grabbed a screenshot of the document. Some of it is proprietary information. So it's quick, but I wanted you to be able to see what we did with the change there. All right. Come on. Not going to work. All right, let's see if we can do this another way. All right, can you see the screen now? Looking for nodding heads? Okay. So this is the example of the business process narrative. This is the evaluating graduation applications. So you'll see all the stakeholders have been identified. At the end of the document, there's initial draft and the initials of the person who first drafted, and then there was revised edits. So we've got those noted as well. Current process overview and process steps. And then the proposed changes, strike through in red font would show where the changes would be. And this was to help us to be able to see that and also to present that to our leadership. And then at the bottom, rationale and impact. So we tried to brainstorm everybody who would be impacted by the change and how they would be impacted so that we could write that down and get that, identify any risks and be able to address anything that could be a negative impact from the change. And we also wanted to recognize anything that would be a good change. And then the requirements. So in the template, I put a couple of notes if anyone is interested in me sending that out. The requirements part, that's where you write where it would be beneficial for your leadership to know what it's going to take to support this change. And then in the second note there is use this opportunity wisely. And then there's a timeline there at the bottom. So I will switch back over to our PowerPoint. Apologize for the difficulty there. All right. Hope you can still see my screen. We'll move on. All right, now we move into the next part. So prioritizing BPAs for your office. And this is where you actually get to do a roadmap for your team and where you're going to plan out mapping those business processes and then how you're going to accomplish those discovery sessions and the documentation that goes along with them. And I encourage you to have some fun with this. So the very first thing is to brainstorm all the processes in your area, and it's very helpful to do this with your team. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide pretty quickly. So in the brainstorming and doing that with your team, we set this up as a retreat last March. And this is a picture of our team working together. So I gave them different topics, and the different topics had different colors stickies. Excuse me. And they had 5 to 10 minutes to brainstorm anything related to that particular topic. When those 5 or 10 minutes were done, I switched out the color of the sticky note. We did the same thing again, and we did 4 main topics and covered a lot of things that were going on within the registrar's office. This was very helpful for me. I had been in the role for 3 weeks, and we knew that we were going to be switching to another student information system. We were going to be switching from our current system that is not integrated with anything except for student, and we were going to be going to an ERP. So it was going to be cross-functional. It was going to involve the entire campus. So we knew that our business processes would need to be mapped in order to make that conversion smoother and the transition smoother as well. So that was the catalyst, and it helped me learn what was going on within the office. Once we had everything brainstormed, we then grouped them by umbrella tasks. So let's see, I think I zoom in. Yes, you can see here. So the 4 main colors: students, faculty, staff, and then behind the scenes. And then they're grouped. You'll see the circles on the whiteboard. Remember, these are 4 different people writing down and brainstorming in a 5 to 10 minute time period, and a lot of them would write down the same thing. So when it comes to final grades, there's a final grade here. That's what this is. Everybody wrote either missing grades or final grades. So we grouped them all together. Once we had them grouped together, I gave each person 5 sticky dots. That's what the orange dots are. And they had 5 minutes to put sticky dots on the things that were the most problematic from their perspective. And that's how we prioritized our list of BPAs that we wanted to go through. And the most problematic one was the graduation application. And we ended up going through that together in that retreat session. That's how I taught them how to do a business process analysis. And thankfully, we learned how to do that together in person, because the next week is when we actually went remote. And we had to learn how to do this again, but on Zoom. All right, so that comes to the end of the main things that I have prepared. I wanted to give you guys time to ask any questions or have any conversation that this conversation may have sparked for you. Does anybody have any questions? I don't see anything in the chat.
Elizabeth, there's a chat from Charlotte. How long from start to finish did your graduation application analysis take?
The analysis took it probably took us an hour to map out that process, and I don't want to give anybody whiplash, but I'll get back to that example. This right here, it probably took us an hour to map out the process. And then it took me another hour to write the document with the current process. And in this session and included in the hour, the team had a lot of ideas about how to improve that process, because I told them there is a desire from leadership to decrease the timeline. And so they were brainstorming ideas for that change, and that's also included in that 1 hour session for this one process. So 2 to 3 hours overall for mapping it out, and then writing out the documentation.
All right, there are a couple more questions, and Charlotte did also say thank you. From Susan, how do you get people on board with even doing an analysis when they're resistant to change and feel how it is being done is working just fine?
I think the very first thing is to just encourage a conversation about how it's being done currently. And maybe don't even mention the word change. Just map it out. Say, we need to document this and we need to visualize it differently. Not for change necessarily, but we just need to see it. And we need to make sure that we're all on the same page as it's being done correctly. A lot of people who don't necessarily like change, like things to be done right and done well, especially in registrar's offices. We are very much attention to detail folks, so that may be a helpful way to put it in context rather than saying, we're going to change this, so let's talk about that.
All right, from Tracy. Do you include instructions for how to complete process in your SIS and your documentation and screenshots, and both with question marks?
Yes, we do. So not in the narrative, but the narrative gets us closer to that documentation. And that was one thing that I heard in those questions or those statements at the beginning in the introduction. Those are things that I heard when I was starting here at Anderson. My staff would say, our documentation is not thorough, or we don't have documentation on that, or it's not well organized. And we all wanted it to be better. But if you look at documentation of an entire office, it again feels daunting, and you're trying to eat the entire elephant. So that's why we had this first session and tried to break it down into manageable steps. So now that the process map is in place and the narrative, it's so much easier just to take those steps and add screenshots to them.
All right, a question from Carol. How many people do you typically have on your mapping teams?
That's a great question. It depends on the size of your institution and the size of the process. So I've been a part of mapping sessions that had 20 to 30 people involved. That was at a larger institution. And then most of my sessions over the last year have been 4 to 10 people involved in this discussion.
All right, thank you from everybody. There are no more questions right now in the box.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much for your time. Evan has put my email address in the chat. Feel free to connect, and I'll be happy to send out that template to anybody who requested it.
Elizabeth.